Welcome to the Story Fulfilled podcast, where we deep dive into how each character and story in the Bible come together to fulfill the story of God.
I'm Fletcher.
I'm Jay, and today's story is about Hagar's visit.
Ooh, we're in it. We're middle of this. No, not quite mid-season yet, I guess.
Yeah. It's actually only episode 2, Fletcher. Don't get ahead of yourself.
I know, I was going to say, we're deep into the season. No, we're 2 episodes in.
2 episodes in.
But it's going.
It's going. And we're still in the Old Testament. So we talked about, the whole season is about encounters with Jesus. And so you're like, well, Jesus isn't in the Old Testament. And we're here to say, oh, but he is.
And if you don't think so, let us know. Email us. We'd love to have a conversation about it. But yeah, absolutely. We're in it. We're in the Old Testament. We're in the book of Genesis today. Again.
That's right.
We might be in it a few times, actually.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
There's
a spoiler.
There's a lot. There's a lot. Of course, as always, we do encourage you to read the stories for yourselves in order to get the whole picture of what is going on. And today's story, as Fletcher said, does take place in Genesis. So we're back. We're talking about Hagar today. And Hagar is a servant of Sarai.
A slave.
She is a slave. That's right. Yeah. As we said, we're talking about encounters with Jesus throughout the Bible. Last week, we heard about Jesus in creation and his involvement in creation, and even what the New Testament says about him and about that involvement in creation. And this week, we're still in Genesis, but we're jumping forward a few chapters. And since last week's story, the world has completely changed. Literally.
You heard very good several times last week.
That's right.
You're not going to hear that this week.
That's right, because following the very, very good, something bad happened, right? Yeah. And there was the fall. So God created Adam and Eve in the garden, but humanity, through Adam and Eve, rebelled against God and were separated from him. Sin entered the world, and there were consequences to sin. I mean, we could just pause there and just, that's a truth that we need to remember, be mindful of. There are consequences of sin.
Yeah, when we tell God to get lost, there's punishment. there's consequences that follow if we tell him to get out of here.
That's actually a really good definition for sin, is telling God to get lost.
Yeah, let's do it our own way, and we see what happens.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, there's lots to chew on there. So there's consequences. And so before this story, we also have the flood, because the consequences and the rebellion just grew and grew and grew. And God was like, something's got to change, right? And so God's anger burned at humanity, and so he brought a flood, but Noah and his children were spared by God. And so basically, the whole world was restarted through Noah. And just to interject, immediately it's not good.
Yeah.
Right? So the sin problem wasn't erased by the flood.
Yeah. No, it says Noah was a righteous man, but he wasn't perfect.
Right.
And his kids certainly weren't
perfect.
His kids
certainly weren't.
And things go bad. Basically, they land off the ark, and immediately he gets drunk, and his son does stupid things. And it's crazy.
Not good. Not good. So we fast forward a bit in the story, and we're introduced to Abram and Sarai, who are called by God to leave their hometown and to go and trust God, who has promised them land and many children. And Abram listens, even though God didn't say where he was. He just said, "Leave,
follow me into the land. I will show you."
Yeah, and Abram's like, "Okay, I'm good. Let's go." And so he listens, and he goes where God sends him. And Abram and Sarai take their family and their things, and they move everything to the land of Canaan. Now, when we say family, it's extended family. It's not. They don't have any children.
It's not just his wife.
No,
and his donkey.
That's right.
It's the whole caravan of.
There's cousins, servants, all this stuff, and he's Abram. From what we understand, is fairly wealthy. Like he's not.
He's kind of like the father of a household. Right? Yeah. He has people under him, and he has a whole... Well, he's not a father of children yet. We know that. But he's going to have lots of servants and possessions and animals, and so he's taken his whole household. If you get the old sense of the word household,
that's right.
Abraham's taken it all,
and so they end up in Egypt. And things aren't amazing there because he's like, well, Pharaoh's going to see how beautiful my wife is, and he's going to want her. And if he finds out that I'm her husband, then I'm dead. So let's just say you're my sister.
Bad move.
Right? And Pharaoh is troubled by God as a result of taking her or attempting to take her as his wife, and finds out about the whole thing, and they're kicked out. They're kicked out for lying because Pharaoh tried to marry her, but God stopped him. And this is where we are assuming that they are connected with Hagar. That they because when he sends them away, he gives them servants.
Kind of appease God, right? Say, well, God, don't smite me, don't do anything. I'm sorry, I was wrong.
So they're given livestock and servants and all this stuff. And Hagar, we presume is among those gifts, if you will, that are given.
If people could be gifts.
Right.
I'm glad people aren't gifts now.
People are not gifts. Let's just leave it at that.
Unless you're having kids, then you can say they're a gift from God. But
that's right.
Don't gift people anymore. Don't do that.
Don't gift people.
If you take one thing away.
That's right. So they go on, and things kind of get a little dicey between Abram and his nephew Lot. And so Lot takes his family and separates from Abram. And we see Abram is concerned for Lot and actually fights in a few wars to protect Lot. And God visits him once again, and this time it's in a vision, and it's actually really neat. And this is actually where, if you look at it, this is where we get our covenant of marriage. This is a covenant that we see that's made between God and Abram. I think Abraham at this time, and there's the passing through an aisle, basically, and it's the person who is meant to uphold the covenant who passes through the aisle. So in marriage, it's the husband and wife who pass down the aisle, and they are both meant to uphold the covenant. But in this dream, or in this vision, it's only God who passes through the aisle, and that's a pretty important thing about understanding covenants and God and his part and our part. But that's not actually the point of our story. It's
a cool aside.
That's
where we get the idea of circumcision, and it's actually where sacrifices start to happen as well. And we see God has made a promise, and all we have to do is listen to him.
That's right.
It's the only God has promised Abraham all these crazy, cool things, the land of Israel, that he'd have many children, and that through him the whole world would be blessed.
Right.
And all they have to do is say, okay. Yes, please.
Exactly. You do, God, and I'm here, and I'll do what you ask me to do, and that's the covenant, and that's what is given to Abram, and he's told, you will go on to be the father of great nation, and they will have this land, and that the whole world will be blessed, and that leads us into today's story.
Exactly. And so Abraham, right? He's the father of the kind of the nation of Israel. Historically, when we look at it, it's roughly 2000 BC. And of course, just like every other biblical or ancient figure, nobody agrees.
Right.
Nobody actually says this is exactly when it happened. And it's kind of hard to know because it's not like they had history books. It's not like they had an iPhone with a calendar.
They weren't dating time.
No, 2000 BC is what we started calling it 2,000 plus years later.
Right.
Anyway. So roughly 2000. Some say he's born earlier in the 2200s BC, and that's based on an interpretation of a verse in Exodus. Some say 1800 BC. I lean towards that one because it really fits well with the biblical and the archaeological evidence.
Say that 6 times.
That we have kind of in the area. But I'd encourage you to go look up the debate, look up the information, look up the archaeology, and try to figure out where Abraham is, if that interests you in any way. It does me anyway. So we have Abraham roughly 4,000 years ago living in a place called Ur of the Chaldees. And so this is in ancient Mesopotamia, which is in modern day Iraq or Iran. It's kind of on the Euphrates River. And like Jay said, he's called to leave everything and go.
That's what he does.
So keep in mind, Abraham, probably doesn't know this God very well who has called him, right? Mesopotamia wasn't a monotheistic society. They were polytheistic. They had all sorts of gods that they worshipped. And so Abraham has been called by the one true God, but he doesn't know much about it. And so Hagar, who we're talking about today, also comes from a polytheistic society. She's Egyptian. And as we know, the Egyptians have lots of gods as well. So she's put in kind of this weird situation where she grew up Egyptian with all these gods, and now she's a slave to these Mesopotamians who have all sorts of other gods.
Right.
Except they're a weird family that has been called out by this one true God. And so she's kind of stuck in the middle, probably doesn't know a lot about what's going on and who God is, but that's where she is, and that's what she is living through right now as we get into this story.
Mm-hmm.
And so we pick up the story in Genesis chapter 16, if you want to read along or look along with us. And basically, Abram and Sarah are waiting for the child to be born. They've been promised all these great things, but they're like 90-something years old. Sarah's 90-something years old. And she's
beyond the years of childbirth, I believe it says in the text.
90, I think that's above it. If you're trying to have kids at 90, you better be called by God to have kids, because I doubt it's going to happen. Yeah, really. Anyway, they're waiting, and it doesn't happen right away. I think it's like 25 years before it ends up, spoilers, actually happening.
Right.
And so it's been years and years, and they're like, okay, this isn't happening. Sarah gets frustrated. Clearly, God hasn't chosen me to have this child. But I have this slave Hagar, and, Abraham, you should sleep with her, have a child, and then we can start a family. We can fulfill God's plan for them through this baby that Hagar has. And so Abraham's like, oh, okay, I guess so.
What an idiot.
I know. If your wife ever tells you to sleep with somebody else, don't do it. It's a trap, as they say. And so Abraham agrees and sleeps with Hagar, and she conceives and she gets pregnant.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm assuming, like we just don't sleep with other women even if your wife tells you to. Things get awkward between Abraham and Sarah and Hagar.
As they would.
And Hagar kind of almost gets like this entitlement of, I'm having this baby for Abram. I'm pretty important. Mm-hmm. And Sarah's like, but I'm the wife, I'm the mother, I'm the head of, or the wife of the household.
Mm-hmm.
And so they start to disagree. And so Hagar starts mistreating Sarah, and Sarah complains to Abraham. She's like, you're slave, you deal with it. I don't want any part of it. And so Sarah starts mistreating Hagar, and they get in all these arguments. And Hagar ends up running away. This pregnant woman has now run away into the wilderness. And so keep in mind, it's not like she's going next door to her sister's house.
No.
That's all they've got. They're shepherds, they're nomads, they live in the wilderness, they're keeping animals. And she runs away into the wilderness, pregnant and all alone. And so that's where we pick the story, and it's in Genesis chapter 16.
Great. So we're going to read from Genesis 16, verses 7 to 14. It says, the angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness, along the road to Shur. The angel said to her, Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from, and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she replied. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. Then he added, I will give you more descendants than you can count. And the angel also said, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, which means God hears, for the Lord has heard your cry of distress. This son of yours will be a wild man, as untamed as a wild donkey. He will raise his fist against everyone, and everyone will be against him. Yes, he will live in open hostility against all his relatives. Thereafter, Hagar used another name to refer to the Lord, who had spoken to her. She said, you are the God who sees me. She also said, I have truly seen the one who sees me. So that well was named Bir Lahai-roi, which means well of the living one who sees me. It can still be found between Kadesh and Bered.
And so if you're reading that along with Jay, you hear all these locations and you're like, what the heck does that mean? Where is that? Where is that? Keep in mind that the people reading this originally lived in that area. And so it's like, oh, hey, it's at the Walmart down the road, right. Between this street and that street. That's what they're saying, and saying this is actually where God met Sarah. And she set up a marker.
Hagar.
Excuse me. That's awkward. I think they'd both be mad at me.
That's right.
Excuse me. Anyway, so Hagar gets met by God at this well. And he says, where are you going? And I see you. And so we're going to get into what that story means and maybe how that fulfills the story of God and how Hagar had an encounter with the living God and with Jesus himself.
But we're going to invite someone in to talk to us or talk with us about it.
All right. Stay tuned.
Yeah, don't go anywhere. Hey, thanks for listening. We really hope that you're enjoying today's episode. Want to just take the opportunity to remind you that if you have any questions or anything that's come up in the episode or any of our podcast episodes, we'd love to hear from you. So take the opportunity to reach out to us, story@bfmc.org, send us an email, or you can drop into our Instagram where you can interact with us, sending comments or DMs there. And that is Story Fulfilled Podcast, all one word, on Instagram. We'd love to hear from you. Now back to our guest.
And we're back.
And we are.
We have a very special guest this episode.
It's a true story.
I don't want to make you feel that special. No offense. We say that for every episode so far.
I'm special. It's okay.
Yes, she is. All right.
One day, we've decided Fletcher's going to throw in a very, very special guest as the intro. And,
it could be.
And that will elevate
Hopefully
that guest.
It doesn't show my favoritism.
Hard to avoid at that point.
We might have a family member of his on tap, so we'll see if that happens then.
Multiple family
Multiple,
members.
that's right.
That's where our guests come from, is family members and people
Fletcher's family
at our church. But yeah, so very special guest. You might have heard her already, Allison Jacobson, and she's going to be talking to us about the story and a little bit about what she does. So Allison, who are you and what do you do?
Who am I? Good question. I am the executive director of Camp Promise Barrie. I've been in Barrie for about 3 years now. Originally from London, moved around a little bit and ended up back in Barrie. And ministry is kind of what I do.
Nice.
So found Camp Promise and I've been with them for 3 years.
Awesome. We've actually worked with Allison at camp this past
That's
summer,
right.
and it's a lot of fun. And she does some really cool stuff with kids in the
That's
community.
true.
But absolutely. So we're here talking to her about this story of Hagar. And so we usually start off with a fun question, and she hasn't heard it yet. So here we go.
Right.
This is the male version. It's what's the best way to appease your spouse? I'm going to say spouse because it said wife, but you don't have one of those. So what's the best way to appease your wife? I have a surefire way every single time.
Well, I'm just thinking because you recently preached and mentioned your wife and mentioned disagreements, and I think your answer is that you finally just shut up.
Wow,
that's kind of
you're not.
That's
wrong.
what I drew from that.
You're not wrong. You're not wrong. Well, it's close. My answer is shut up, and I'm gonna go make food.
Okay,
I'm gonna go cook dinner and make some good food.
Yeah,
that appeases a lot of problems. If you're hungry, you get a little grumpy.
Yeah,
Riley gets a little grumpy. I get grumpy. So just make food.
Deal with the hangry.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Mine, kitchen. So every night, the kitchen is my thing before I go to bed. So like Michelle being able to wake up and see a clean kitchen is good. Every now and then on my day off when she leaves for work, she'll jokingly, air quote jokingly, say, "Thanks for cleaning the house today." And I take that as a cue. And so now it doesn't need to be the whole house, just that, get that kitchen done and the bathrooms, get to work on the bathrooms and that, yes, it's a ticket to happiness.
Clean house. Every time that our house will be messy, and I'm really bad at this, but Riley will come, "Oh, do you want to do this?" And as soon as she says, "Can you do this?" it instantly flips a switch. I don't want to do that.
That's right.
I'll be happily cleaning away, and then she'll be like, "Oh, can you do this?" I'm like,
"Can you sweep the floor?" And then
sweeping
the floor is the biggest task known to humanity.
Yeah.
It's that whole wanting to go our own way thing, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm. Comes right back to that sin problem.
That's right.
I think clean kitchen for us too.
This could go either way, I guess. How would you appease your spouse, or how could your spouse appease you? Because it was written as wife, and the word appease maybe is
playing with fire a little bit.
Playing with fire, a little problematic, but go ahead.
I mean, a clean kitchen in our house is a big one too. Nathan would definitely say that dishes away, counters wiped down, space to put stuff down. We don't have a lot of counter space in our house, so if you turn around and there's dishes everywhere, pots and pans, it's But coffee.
Oh, yeah.
Coffee is a good one. No matter what is happening, if you can make somebody a cup of coffee and bring it to them, that solves all kinds of problems.
It is true. It is true. Most days I do try and make the coffee for both of us. And yeah.
I don't do that. I'm sorry. Sorry, Riley.
Neither of you drink coffee.
She gets the tea from Tim Hortons. Maybe I get a Tim Hortons card and that'll help. But I don't make the tea.
That's right.
Maybe I should start, and then that'll help things out.
There you go. Just buy a kettle.
But, yeah, well, we have a kettle. I don't have the tea. Yeah, it's not like tea has a lot of
Not
ingredients.
complicated.
No.
Anyway, so yeah, let's get into this conversation about Hagar. And so we kind of asked this question: what's the best way to appease your wife? Because Hagar is in this really awkward situation.
Yeah.
I think going into this, she's pregnant. She has this kid. She's fighting with I don't even know what to call it,
her master,
yeah, and the mother of the household. And Abraham doesn't really want anything to do with her now. So Hagar is left in this situation, like we just talked about. And she's out in the wilderness, and God meets her where she is.
Yeah.
And so that's what we want to kind of talk about right now. And so the first kind of question I want to think about is this idea of God seeing us, and have you felt that affect your relationship with God in any way? No rush. You can take time.
I mean, I feel like we could be here all day to answer that question, right? Like we could go through all the little ups and downs, big moments, small moments. There's lots of ways that we can see that God is with us and sees us. We could also be here all day talking about all the ways that God doesn't, right? Where we feel, not that he isn't, but that we feel that we're like in this wilderness and in this desert thing. And I think it's really cool in this story to tie that in, that she's not in a city. She's not in with her people. She's out in the wilderness, right? She's removed herself from everything that is normal and comfortable and good sort of in her life, despite her awkward situation. And it's in the wilderness that God meets with her, right? And we often talk about, I met with God on the mountaintop. That retreat was so good. That conference was incredible. And we forget about those hard moments where God really comes and meets with us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's interesting that, God meets with us in that wilderness, especially with Hagar. Hagar withdrew herself from community, as good or bad as community may have been, withdrew herself, and God said, "Hold up, let's work this one through a little bit." And I recently had a conversation with a guy. I was playing hockey with him, and he's going through a situation where he's kind of withdrawn from community. And my advice, it was kind of like, keep seeking Jesus, because I understand your difficulty in that, but keep seeking Jesus, because he wants to meet you in the midst of that. And the reality is, and God does this here with Hagar, he wants to call us back into community. Yeah. And that doesn't mean he wants to call us back into community by making that community blemish free and perfect and good and everything is roses and peaches. It's still the same community that we left that has its problems, but God is saying, I'm with you in the midst of that, and I want to lead you in that. Yeah.
That's the cool thing, is he's not trying to change everybody else in the community, and he's not necessarily trying to change Hagar right away. He's just saying, I see what you're going through.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm going to meet you there, and you're called by me just like everybody else has been called by me, and I'm going to show you who you are and who I am.
Right.
So that's a really cool part of the story.
And that ties in, just kind of, for those of you who are listening, on release schedule where we are as a church is we're going through our Lenten series, and we're looking at Jesus, and it's Behold Him. But a couple of weeks ago, I spoke about the very real human experience of Jesus, and he gets us, right? Maybe that's an interesting phrase because of the whole Super Bowl commercial, which I'm just going on a rant there. But he had a very real human experience and experienced the things that we experience. And in the midst of that, he still calls us into community where we can hash through those things and work through them.
Mm-hmm. So, in that idea of he gets us and he sees us, Allison, you work with a lot of kids in the community is how you'd say it, but and you want them to experience God, you want them to experience love and community and all these sorts of things. How has kind of this idea of God seeing us, seeing these kids, kind of impacted how you help them, how you talk them through life and whatever's going on with them.
Sure. Just to give a little bit of background for those who are listening and have no idea what Camp Promise is, we do an after-school program mainly, but we also do March break and summer camps. And our primary demographic is, like you said, community kids from under-resourced families. And I mean, under-resourced used to be called at-risk. It used to be low income. It encompasses all of those things. And so vast majority of the families that we deal with are missing resources in some way. They either don't have enough support system. They may not have financial stuff. They are, in a lot of ways, very similar to Hagar. Hagar is far from home, right? You guys talked last time about how in Egypt, when Abram and Sarai are there, and the Pharaoh says, okay, go, so that God is not going to smite me, take all these things with you, that Hagar is probably one of those gifts. Yeah. And so she's far from home. She has no support system, no friends, no people, no means to support herself. So in her running away, this is not like, hey, I saved up and I planned for this and I went. There's no saving up happening here. She's getting 3 meals a day and a roof over her head. And a lot of our families can identify, I think, with where she's at, right? They don't know where their next meal is coming from. Sometimes they don't know what their living situation is going to look like. We had a family last year who had a broken relationship, very similar to this kind of a living situation, and they were on the verge of living in their car. These are the kinds of like heartbreaking stories that just bring me back to this. And so in a lot of ways, I can see so many correlations and so many similarities between the families that we work with and what Hagar is going through, just this awful situation, this feeling stuck in a bad place, bad relationships. And so in answer to your question, Fletcher, we spend a lot of time with our kids encouraging them and trying really hard not to give just a pat answer. Right. Starting with the acknowledgement of, yes, we know it's hard. Yeah. You really got to start and connect with that emotional piece in them, help them not only to recognize and feel it, but to also say, okay, yes, it's hard, but there's hope. And pointing them to Jesus in that is a key piece. And then bringing that community, Jay, that you talked about around them is just huge for them, giving them the resources that they don't have, and in whatever way that we're able to do that.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. It's like, that is the character of God that we're trying to show in this podcast, right? We're encounters with Jesus. Hagar has been met by God where she's at, and God basically says, I see what you're going through, and it sucks. It's hard, and that's so encouraging to see people doing that in real life to people in the real world, in communities, doing it with kids, and showing them, well, love, and showing them who God is in the world. And I don't want to bring back what I preached the other day, but that's exactly what we've been commanded to, is to show the love of God in the world. And so that's what God does to Hagar, and that's what Allison through Camp Promise is trying to do, which is really, really cool.
Yeah, and that what that leaves the individual with is the same thing that Hagar was left with, which was this confirmation that God sees me. And maybe for the kids at Camp Promise, it might be Allison sees me, or one of the interns sees me, which is how they experience it or internalize it. But the reality is it's God through Allison, or God through those who are working with them, that sees them. And the hope and prayer is that they would be able to internalize that and recognize that that is God, and that's God's calling them into something deeper.
Along these lines, there's a story in the New Testament, because again, we're talking about this encounter with Jesus. There's a story in the New Testament in John, and it really reminded me similar to the story of Hagar. It's when Jesus is sitting by this well in Samaria, and this woman comes up, and she's had 5 or so husbands, is living with some random guy, and Jesus is like, I know where you are. I see you. Yeah. And he basically calls her and says, you got to follow me. You got to drink my water. And that's how you're going to fix your problem. And Jesus meets her where she is. She's sitting at this well, kind of living however she's living, and tired of it and sick of it. And Jesus meets her there. And I found that's so cool that it connects back to that Old Testament. Jesus is always the one who's there to meet you where you are.
Related to the Hagar story as well, like, a lot of people read the story of the woman at the well, and they, because he says, go get your husband. And she says, I don't have a husband. He says, you're right. You've had this many, and the man you're with now is not your husband. A lot of people take that as like a rebuke on her lifestyle choices, but the reality is, contextually, it was probably more that she was a victim of her circumstances, and it wasn't that she was living promiscuously. It was because she was outcast by society, and so she was forced into a situation with this man who wasn't her husband. Similar to Hagar, who was forced into a relationship with Abram, who wasn't her husband. So, yeah, there's that similarity there as well.
Yeah, the victim of circumstance is such a big thing, because as Christians, we often want to deny that
That's right.
happens.
That's
it's
right.
like, oh, it's all your own fault.
That's right.
But if we look at situations, people are in some hard life situations. And so treating them as if God sees them and loves them is one of the most important things we do, and not trying to blame them for their situation or I don't even know how to say that.
No, but it's true. And it happens a lot.
And being able to see and empathize with them and show them that, yes, I get it, and I'm going to help you, and I'm going to be there for you.
Yeah.
And so the last question that we usually ask is, how does this story come together to fulfill the story of God? And so we'll kind of talk about that. You can answer that in your own way, however you hear that and think about it, because it's kind of a weird question, but that's what we try to unpack. Is we're seeing God, we're seeing Jesus in this story, and how can we understand it through the rest of the Bible? I'll call Jay out first. I'll say, Jay, what do you think?
Give me some time to think about it.
Exactly.
Well, and I do think that just wrapped up in what Hagar says, that that she's been seen by God. This is the God who sees. That I think is just foundational to our understanding of who God is, and our situation or circumstances, because we figuratively are just like Hagar, and even so much so that we are a victim of our circumstances, in that we've been born into a world that's infected with sin, and so being that, we're at a loss, right? Like how can I get out of this pit that I'm in? How can life be better, fuller? And God shows up and says, with me, right? Remain in me as I in you, and the promise that I give is life to the full. And so I do think that's that God who sees. God saw us. God saw our plight. He sent his one and only Son to take away that wedge that was between us and make it so that we could have a relationship with him.
I like the fact that she names God.
Right.
She gives him this name. He has seen me. And when you think of all these names of God in the Bible, you look through them, and one of the biggest ones in the New Testament is Emmanuel. We talk about Emmanuel constantly, and that's literally God is with us.
Right.
And so that's the person of Jesus, and Hagar saw that characteristic of God all the way back then. Right. And then they saw Jesus in the flesh, God with us, and that continues up until today. God is present with us. God sees us. Yeah. And people can experience that now, just as they did with Jesus, just as Hagar did with God in the Old Testament in Genesis. And so this story just keeps unfolding of who God is, and he's a God who sees us, who is with us, even though we don't always see him, and it's hard, and it's and it's long, but
I think it's just a really beautiful picture. I love your point, Jay, that we are all Hagars, because I think we are to an extent. On the flip side of that, though, I love that it is kind of encapsulating what the ministry of Jesus is all about. She's in pain. She's in distress. She is the least of these in this story, and God chooses to meet with her. And that's exactly what Jesus' ministry was all about, right? He didn't come to the Pharisees. He didn't come to those who were already getting it right. He came to those who were lost. And if you think about the story of the 100 sheep, right? And one goes missing. She is that one sheep. Yeah. And God goes out and meets with her. And he could have gone to the one he made covenant with. He could have gone to Abram and been like, fix this now. Right. Or he could have gone to Sarah and he could have said, you need to go and you need to make it right. And he didn't. He went to Hagar, who really, more than anything, needed to be known and needed to be seen and recognized that she still did have value. And what an example and challenge for us to look for the Hagars around us and say, who is it that is either removing themselves from community or who is in need, is in pain, and is in distress, and doesn't need a lecture on who they are, doesn't need a lecture on what they should be doing, but just needs me to say, I see you, and I'm there for you. And so I think we both are charged with this ministry of Jesus to go and be that to others around us, while at the same time balancing that juxtaposition of I am Hagar while I'm also trying to be Jesus to the Hagars around me.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Awesome.
Well, that's why you just sparked so, like, I've got another podcast episode in my brain, so I'm gonna shut up now.
Nice. No, that is so great. Absolutely. I don't even know what to say. Like that hits the nail on the head. Absolutely. So if we can leave you with one thing, it's that God sees you and he wants you to go out and he wants you to see others and love on them and show them who he is. And so that's what we're called to. That's just right. Like God called Hagar, he saw her. So thanks for listening. Allison, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing all your wisdom and the cool things that you're doing. So hope
Thanks
to
for
see
having
you.
me.
Yeah, awesome.
Bye for now.
Bye for now.
Bye.